Hello everybody, this is Travis and I am fired up and ready to kind of talk training with you guys again today, and we are going to be diving into a subject I actually haven't touched on for a while, but is the subject that kind of blew up this channel. Well, blew up, maybe more firecracker, with the size of the channel relative to some, but it is important, and so that is going to be heart rate training. So we're going to talk about some problems with heart rate training and kind of debunk some of the kind of common fallacies of heart rate training in this video today. And if you haven't had a chance to kind of catch those early videos, I definitely recommend you doing that. There's a lot of really good content there. The main goal for me in kind of talking about this is not necessarily to explain how to train with heart rate, because training with heart rate properly is very nuanced and it's very complex. It's not as kind of simplistic as the people selling heart rate monitors or selling heart rate training books want to make it seem, because it's difficult to sell complexity. It's very easy to sell simplicity. But what I do hope to do is kind of save you guys time by preventing you from kind of going in a direction that is going to waste your training time. And I think that's the worst thing that any coach can do with an athlete, is waste their time, all right? Because once you've spent that time, you can't get it back, all right? And I think that for a lot of coaches, what differentiates great coaches from good coaches is their ability to really make the most of that time, all right? So it's a matter of efficiency. It's not necessarily a matter of kind of knowing this is better than that or more effective than that. It's about how you're using your time, all right? And certainly, I think, with heart rate training, because it is simplistic and people like that kind of clear goal of what should I do, and I get that question a lot in the comments, is what should I do? And the answer is always complex. The answer is there's a lot of nuance there, and sometimes the answer is simple, but most of the times it is not. But with heart rate training, it's very easy to say, here's a heart rate monitor, strap it to your chest. When it says this number to that number, continue at that effort and continue it for X amount of volume. And so that's why it's so popular. And then another fact is that for training zones, particularly for endurance athletes, there's a lot of talk about zone 2 training. I've had videos where I talk and kind of give my perspective on zone 2 training and why I don't think it's particularly effective for rowing at all, and in general may not be effective for everybody in other sports. I think it's less effective in rowing just because rowing requires training at a higher intensity because of the power component, or because of the strength component of rowing, as opposed to the just pure muscular endurance component of a sport like cycling or running, or maybe even swimming. And so, but check out those videos for that. But we're going to talk about a couple reasons why heart rate training just doesn't work. And we're going to talk about some principles that are put out by heart rate training that, if you think about it, all right, so we're just going to use kind of deductive reasoning here. If you think about it, it breaks down, all right, upon scrutiny. All right, and so we'll dive into that here. The first one being the concept of distinct training zones, all right? And so you'll talk about zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and those are all percentages of your max, all right? Now that's an error in the first place of assuming that your calculation of max is accurate, all right? Or that your body comes with a just kind of a progressive scale of effort from rest to maximal work, and that each of those along that line is going to be distinct training zones, all right? So one, a lot of training will be, well, do you use just actual heart rate max, or do you use percentage of heart rate reserve, whatever it may be, or do you estimating your heart rate max? Because honestly, it's very difficult and challenging to get a true reading of your maximal heart rate, because you have to train at a very high intensity, and you have to train anaerobically. And the truth is, most athletes don't have the mental conditioning or the mental capacity to push their body to that level. So those athletes then have to estimate it. So then you're relying on the efficacy of that estimate. And two, are you going to do just pure percentage of heart rate max based on an estimate, or even based on the real max? Or are you going to do heart rate reserve? all of those things, when they're talking about heart rate training zones, you'll never see them say, well, if you're doing it based on heart rate reserve, adjust this way. If you're doing it based on estimate of heart rate max, do this way. If you're doing it based on a true measured value of heart rate max, then do it this way. And the fact is that, even if those were accurate, it would shift, all right, with each of those different things. There's accommodations that you have to make. But going back to the training zones themselves, and this is what really irks me, and this is what I'll talk to my athletes a lot when we are incorporating heart rate training into it, is this idea of you have a zone 2, let's say 60 to 70% of your heart rate max, zone 3, 70 to 80, zone 4, 80 to 90, zone 5, 90 to 100, all right? The simple idea, all right, that you are gonna be in a different training zone at 69% of your heart rate max than you would if you are at 71% of your heart rate max is so unbelievably naive as to kind of boggle my mind that anybody could see that and actually buy into that system, all right? It is an absurd idea that your body's just like, oh, well, we're utilizing oxygen and carbohydrate as our primary energy source, and we're cycling out all that lactic acid, but oh my gosh, your heart rate is 4 beats higher now, all right, lactic acid is coming into the system, all right, because we just can't handle that extra 4 beats in your heart rate, all right? That's absolutely absurd. And so the first takeaway is that in your true heart rate, as it relates to your training zones, is that there's going to be significant overlap between your training effect in one heart rate in your training effect, or your training zone, your heart rate in a training zone, and your heart rate in the next training zone up or the next training zone down. And when I'm talking about training zones, I'm talking about kind of the common rowing zones of UT2, UT1, AT transport, lactate threshold, lactate production removal, or anaerobic lactate training, all right? And so with each of those, all right, people like to say, well, UT2 is this heart rate training zone, all right? And a lot of people are saying it's zone 2. They're wrong for the majority of population. We'll go back to why it's only the majority of the population, all right? And then they'll say zone 3 might be UT1, and zone 4 might be AT transport, and zone 5 might be racing pace or lactate work, all right? And so the heart just doesn't work that way, all right? And so the true training zones are that UT2, UT1, all right? And those are based on your blood lactate concentration, all right? And a lot of people, I'll talk about blood lactate concentration, they're like, well, how do I measure it? You don't need to measure blood lactate concentration, all right, to train effectively, all right? So a well-designed training session is designed to maximize the contribution of a particular energy zone, whether it be a UT2, UT1, AT transport, all right? And so if you have been given a good criteria for what that training session should be and what you should be accomplishing and what you should be feeling on that training session, then you are going to be within that energy zone, all right? Because you could not do a UT2 workout at a UT1 pace, and you could not do a UT1 workout at an AT pace, all right? And so that's kind of, or you could not do it, while achieving all the criteria, all right? So if I say 60 minutes of UT2 at this stroke rate, at this damper setting, then you could get yourself into a UT1 energy zone, and actually talk about that in one of my videos where I'm kind of using a hypothesis of how to kind of push and actually train transport using a lot of typical factors for a UT2 session, but that's an outlier, all right? But I'm saying, but in order to do that, you have to train at an abnormally high intensity on that kind of effort per stroke than you would be prescribed in that workout, all right? So you're taking a factor from another training zone and you're infusing it into that UT2, and as a result you're pushing into a UT1 training zone. Now if you do that, that doesn't mean you're training UT1 effectively, it just means that you're training UT1, all right? If you did a training session at UT1 that was designed for UT1, you're going to train that more effectively, all right? But going back, all right, we're talking about we got to train in these zones, all right, based on your blood lactate concentration. And your heart rate is going to elevate, as you get more and more effort into that training category. All right. So the harder you work, typically the higher your heart rate is going to get. But there are other effects for your heart rate, all right? And so there are other ways to get your heart rate up. The primary one is time, all right? The time you spend on effort, your heart rate will rise, even if you're staying at consistent effort, all right? That is your cardiac drift, all right? And I talk about cardiac drift in some of my videos as well. And another reason why these idea of heart rate training zones is baloney, all right? Is that if you stay at a UT2 effort for 90 minutes, 120 minutes, you may spend the early part of that effort in what would be a zone 2, and then you may be spending the majority of that effort in what would be a zone 3, and you may even kind of bump into a zone 4 at the very later end of that session, all right? And so that heart rate drift is going to be pushing that heart rate, and so the more time you spend at that effort, the higher the heart rate's going to get. Does that mean that you're changing your training zone? Does that mean that if you're holding the same pace for UT2, that 90 minutes in, you're now training a different energy zone because your heart rate is in zone 3 instead of the zone 2 that it was in for the first 30 minutes? No, it's still UT2. You're still getting a UT2 training effect, all right? And then consequently, for the overlap, all right, there is a lot of overlap, all right? UT2 and UT1 overlap significantly. And generally, the training zone that you're hitting in, wherever you're going to finish in the last third of that training session, typically for your heart rate, is going to be what would be normally prescribed for that training zone for heart rate by all these books and texts and whatnot. Whereas the first third and maybe in the first 2/3 of that workout, you're probably going to be in the heart rate zone for the category below it, all right? So if I'm doing a UT1 session, then for the first half to 2/3 of that workout, I'm going to be seeing heart rates that are fairly typical for a UT2 session. And it's not going to be into the latter part of that UT1 effort that my heart rate is going to rise into that, what I would say is more characteristic and more specific to UT1, all right? And again, I'm holding the same pace for that amount of time, but the longer you spend on an effort, the more your cardiac drift is going to have that effort rise, or that heart rate rise, and so you're going to get to a new training category, all right? And so, if you just say, well, I'm training zone 2 today, or zone 3 today, or zone 4 today, what you get a lot of people is that the longer they go, and especially for these lower heart rate zones, this zone 2 in particular, you have to put a lot of volume in at zone 2 to get a training effect. And a lot of people that don't understand heart rate, and they're just saying, well, I have to stay within the 60 to 70% or 65 to 75. It actually is defined differently depending on kind of where you look at of what zone 2 is. Then basically what they'll find is that the longer they go, they'll find themselves having to slow down in order to keep their heart rate in the thing. And then they're slowing down and they're coming away from their ideal training pace, and they're losing the efficacy of that training session, all right? They're losing the value of the time that they're investing, and they're losing it at the kind of the most important part, all right? Because your training stimulus happens in the last, quarter to a third of your training sessions. You're not inducing your training stimulus a third of the way into your steady states, or even a third of the way into your oxygen transport workouts, all right? It's that last little bit that is the bit that is kind of pushing your body out of its comfort zone and telling it you need to adapt, you need to make a change so that you're better able to handle this kind of training volume, all right? And so distinct training zones, all right, it's a problem. For me, that upper end of UT2 tends to be around 168, all right? And I figured that out through miles of rowing and training to see kind of where, it tends to top out. My UT2, depending on how fit I am, usually tends to top out around 174, 176. And again, it's not even getting to that point into the latter part of that UT1 session, all right? So the first half of my UT1 session, I'm in the high 150s, low, and then eventually mid 160s, and then finally I start to drift up and beyond what would be typical for UT2. Now, AT and transport are even more interesting, all right? And so both AT and transport, you may kind of start with a little bit of overlap, maybe more on your AT than your transport, with a little bit of overlap with that very high-end UT1, all right? So if I'm peaking out around 174, 176 for my personal UT1 sessions, and I'm doing, let's say, 8 by 3 minutes at a transport pace for a transport workout, then the first 1 or 2 efforts, those 3-minute intervals, might not get above a 176 heart rate. All right, it might not be into the later ones that I've even pushing there. And same thing for the anaerobic threshold sessions, those AT sessions, and that I'm probably going to begin the first quarter to half, maybe not half, quarter to a third of that AT interval at a heart rate that it's going to be typical for UT1 before I even get into that AT point. And then going from AT to transport, it's even more interesting because the AT heart rates and the transport heart rates are extremely similar. And for what I find, there's only a very, just a very small amount at the end of that transport sessions that are going to start to push into heart rates that are unique for that transport effort. The reason for that is coming back to cardiac drift, all right? And so AT sessions, all right, are longer, all right? And so it's a lower intensity. Generally, it's averaging about 4 seconds slower on your split than a transport session. But you're doing it for a much longer period of time. And so for my transport intervals, I might be doing anywhere from 2 to 8 minutes for the interval. And for my AT intervals, I might be doing anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, all right, for the interval. And so because of that, if you're comparing an AT session of 10 minutes and a transport session of 3 minutes, even though your transport session is averaging about 4 seconds faster than what you're seeing on that AT, you're only doing it for 3 minutes, all right? And so your heart rate, your cardiac drift has less time to bring that heart rate up, all right? Whereas with AT, the slope of your cardiac drift, all right, which is the cardiac drift, essentially the cardiac drift is defined by the slope of your heart rate curve at a consistent effort. So that in that AT session, if you're spending 10 minutes at a slower pace, but it's still pretty fast, that's 10 minutes for that cardiac drift to bring your heart rate up, all right? And so it's gonna bring it up pretty high. And then you get into your transport session, you're working much harder, but you only have that 3 minutes. And so it's not gonna have as much time to rise. And so what you're gonna find is that your AT intervals, while you're doing a lot less, they're a lot longer. And so your heart rates are gonna be very close and they're gonna overlap the majority of what you're seeing for those early transport pieces, all right? And so for me personally, I would say a top end for an AT session at this point is probably in kind of the low to mid 180s. All right, and for a transport session, it's definitely in the mid 180s, and so some of my AT workouts are not going to push me up into that mid 180 zone unless I'm doing something like maybe 2x4K or 3x4K, where I'm doing a lot of volume in a single interval. It's not going to get up into those 180s, and mid 180s is probably going to stay in the mid to high 170s. Whereas with transport, if I'm doing that transport workout, I'm doing 3x or 8x3 minute intervals, then those early intervals are going to be probably 174, 175, 176. 178, 179, 180, and then in the last few intervals, I'll start peaking out into the 180s. Might peak out at 180, and then 182, and then maybe 183, 184 for the last one. All right, and so this is all why you can't just say, this is my heart rate training zone, and I have to stay into that training zone. All right, because it's going to ignore time as a factor, all right, and it's going to skew effort in terms of what it's telling you with that heart rate, all right? And so going back and saying, well, heart rate training is a useful tool, all right? You can use it. I personally use it. If my athletes have heart rate monitors and they can record it effectively, we use it with that training. But we use it primarily as a reference point, as a data point, and to look back at the training and to see what was happening in that particular training zone, all right? To see, were we able to generate the same amount of effort, or not the same amount of effort, the same amount of work? Were we getting as many meters or maybe more meters? And also averaging a beat or two less on your average heart rate on each of the intervals. That's useful training data because that's indicative of an adaptation, all right? Going back to that though, and going back to another fallacy of the heart rate training zones, is simple things that affect your heart rate that are not your training intensity, all right, which is a ton of things. The most obvious and probably the most impactful are going to be the temperature, the humidity, and your elevation, all right? All of those three things are going to affect your heart rate, and none of those three things affect how hard you're working in terms of your blood lactate concentration. All right, so if you're just going based on your heart rate, all right, and you're like, well, yesterday it was a nice, easy 50-degree, fall day, and your heart rate was X. The next day you could be at the exact same effort with the exact same amount of energy, feeling just as good. And if the temperature is up, suddenly it's 80, 82 that day, all right, because it's an abnormally warm fall day, then that doesn't mean that your heart rate is going to be higher. It's probably going to be, maybe 5 to 10 beats higher on average, all right? And that doesn't mean that you are training at a higher blood lactate concentration, all right? And I'll go back and say it might, like if you are less fit, less conditioned, certainly if you're not used to working out in high heat or high humidity, that will affect you more. And so you may have to be working harder in order to maintain that same effort. But if you're the more well-trained athlete that is not as affected by those changes in temperature, that can just settle into that effort and be fine, their heart rate is still going to be higher, all right, in that higher temperature, higher humidity, and certainly that higher elevation situation, all right? And so going back and looking at that from a scientific perspective, all right, theories are debunked by only one experiment that proves the hypothesis wrong, all right? And so if you're looking at that and you're saying, well, here's one athlete, all right, where zone 2 training is not their UT2 zone or zone, whatever it may be, then that debunks your theory. You can no longer apply that to the general population, all right? It is effective as an estimate, all right? And once you have spent a lot of time training in these various heart rate zones, you can then look at your training data and say, for me, when I'm training at a UT2 zone, these are the heart rates that I'm typically seeing, all right? And you can just take the aggregate of that and kind of ignore the outliers, all right, your statistical outliers, and say, well, for 5%, 10% of my UT2 training, I'm seeing these abnormally high heart rates or these abnormally low heart rates. Ignore those. Stick to the average. Build your heart rate, reverse engineer your heart rate zone based on that. And then you can then use that as a guide, and you can say, well, typically if I'm doing a 60-minute steady state, I'm usually not getting above the 140s, until I'm at least about 10, 15 minutes into that session. And I'm usually not kind of moving beyond the 150s until I'm at least 2/3 of the way, all right? So, 35, 40, 45 minutes of the way into that. If you know that that is the typical pattern for you and your heart rate, you can use that as a guide in your training, all right? Not to dictate your training, all right, but as a guideline, so that if you're rowing along and something feels a little bit off, you can kind of check and be like, oh, that's a little abnormal. Maybe I'll make this little adjustments, all right? And I do that a lot, especially with steady state, because just steady state is so far below your maximal effort, and you're feeling good someday, you want to go hard. You're biting at the bit. You want to go. And sometimes if I'm feeling really good, but I'm feeling the work, but it's good work, and I'll like check my heart rate and be like, ooh, and one, my speed is faster. I'm seeing splits that are good, and then I look down my heart rate and go, oh, I'm 5-10 beats faster than I should be at this point in the workout. I'll be like, all right, I gotta hold back. All right, I gotta bring myself back to where and relax, bring my splits back to where they should be. And if I continue to feel great, then at the end of the workout, then I can kind of lay off those reins a little bit and loosen them up, and then I can kind of push a little bit without going crazy, all right? Without kind of, kicking the stallion and going off, at a gallop. That you don't want to do that, all right? So it's that good guideline. It's there to keep you honest, but you should never be like, setting your alarms on your heart rate, and every time that alarm beeps, you got to slow down. Don't do that, all right? Trust your effort, all right? Trust the workout itself. Trust the stroke rates that you should be for UT2s. Trust the volume that you're doing for UT2, and then trust how it should feel at that volume, and then let the heart rate do itself. Look at your heart rate, download it to your computer, compare it with your other sessions after you're done with your training, and then use it to help determine, am I producing the same amount of work at a lower heart rate or with a flatter cardiac drift? Those are good signs of a positive training adaptation. But there are so many reasons why you can't just say, UT2 is this zone, UT1 is that zone, transport is this zone, AT is this zone, all right? It just doesn't work. All right, so that's it. That's kind of two ways to debunk it. Both external factors can push you out of a heart rate zone with absolutely no reference to how hard you're working, and two, the longer you're working, the more that drift is going to happen. It's going to pull you out of a training zone. And the last one just being is that, and this is, I will do this as a kind of parting thought, and because this was the comment that inspired this conversation today of someone saying, no, I was wrong, that there's lots of evidence saying that zone 2 training is the foundation of the base. And the problem is that for some people, their zone 2 heart rate also happens to intersect with their UT2 effort, all right? And so because they intersect, they assume that is the heart rate that's telling them they're in the right training zone, and not the fact that their blood lactate concentration is appropriate to UT2. And so they think that the heart rate is the determinant factor then not only for them but for everybody. And the truth is that that intersection doesn't happen for a lot of people. All right, for a lot of people, UT2 intersects more with zone 3. Myself being an example, I have athletes whose UT2, will even intersect at the top end of UT3 and a little bit into, zone 3 and a little bit into zone 4. All right, and yeah, I mean, I have athletes that will do steady state at 185 heart rate. That's just the way their heart works, all right, and there's not, it's harder to use heart rate for the athletes because there's not as much difference between their UT2, UT1, transport, etc., etc. And if you just went by heart rate training for those athletes, God, they're going to be they're going at this painfully god awful slow pace for their aerobic volume, and they're going to be wasting their time because they're not going to be getting a training effect, all right, because it's going to be the equivalent of them going for a brisk walk, all right, and it's not going to happen. I've fallen into that myself as I started to read about zone 2 training and heart rate training, and wasted lots of time training at a heart rate zone that would have been zone 2, so in that kind of 130 140 range, where that wasn't my UT2. All right, my UT2 generally averages in the high 150s and it peaks out around 168. I'll start the session in the 140s, in the early on, but once I get a third of the way or so into it, I'm not in that zone 2 anymore. All right, and so if I had listened to that, it wouldn't work for me. For a lot of the athletes that I coach, if they listen to that, it wouldn't have worked for them as well. All right, and so if it does work for you, great, use it. But don't think that zone 2 training is ideal for everybody. It's ideal for a very small percentage of the population. Maybe not very small, but a small percentage of the population. That's it. I've talked enough. Thank you for listening. I really hope this helps, and I hope it definitely saves you wasting lots of training time, doing painfully slow efforts. All right, so that's it. This is Travis signing off. We'll catch you on the next video. Bye.